welcome to this year's Summer Solstice Tour for 2021. My name is Frank Giebfried, and I'm with the Bayport-Blue Heritage Association, and I'll be your guide for today. Our friend and local historian Gene Horton started these tours many years ago. However, he always did Blue Point. Before he passed away, he expressed his wishes that the tours continue and that one day he'd like to do Bayport, and that's what finds us here today. So for our tour today, we're going to be walking down Ocean Avenue down to the Great South Bay. Then we'll cut east and walk back up north on Fairview Avenue. As we go explore this area, we're going to visit the estates of many wealthy businessmen and women. We're going to meet some homes of police officers, some homes of scoundrels, some homes of embezzlers, some homes of crooked judges and outright criminals who spent time in jail. I hope you find this tour to be very interesting. I'd like to thank Gene for starting these tours so many years ago. I'd also like to thank Wendy Bennett from the library for putting this video together. And I'd also like to thank all of the previous heritage members who came before me, who worked so hard on the research in our town that made my job a little bit easier. So thank you, everybody, for that. All right, so let's get started. We're going to walk on down to Middle Road a few hundred feet from here, and we're going to head down and we'll start our tour at the corner of Middle Road and Ocean Avenue. I'll see you there.
In about 1825, Lawrence Edwards, his wife, 4 sons, and 4 daughters came from Barbados and settled in the hamlet of Bayport, purchasing several tracts of land. Among them was the land on the west side of what is now known as South Ocean Avenue. The land on the east side was owned by the Smiths and later the Stoppanis. Shown without a name on an early 1834 map, the road was later called Edwards Lane or Avenue. As wealthy newcomers began establishing their summer estates here, the name was changed to Ocean Avenue. But much to the new residents' consternation, old-timers and even the Patchogue Advance continued to use the moniker of Edwards Avenue. 3 residents addressed the issue in an 1881 letter to the editor of the Advance. Dear Sir, in your recent issue, we noticed the thoroughfare between our respective properties mentioned as Edwards Avenue. Will you please correct this statement in your paper? Last year, we decided upon giving the road the name Ocean Avenue and placed this inscription upon a sign on the northeast corner thereof. The letter was signed by John R. Alley, Harriet B. Paff, and Captain Joseph Vaughn. The era of horses, farmhands, and farms was coming to an end, making way for the summer playgrounds of New York City's wealthy elite. Our first house was built in 1881 for Joseph W. Meeks, Jr. and his wife Caroline by local contractors Arnold and Weeks. The tower you see at right was added 7 years later, and running water, both hot and cold, was an 1896 addition. The Italianate house was originally painted yellow gold with red and green trim. The gingerbread is original, as is the red transom window over the front door. Meeks ran his father's very successful furniture company from 1836 to 1859. The company made its money by producing moderately priced, well-built furniture. When the Civil War broke out, Meeks served in the 55th New York Volunteer Infantry. It seems that after the war he was promoted to colonel. In 1870, the census shows his occupation listed as gentleman. A prominent family, the Meeks accompanied ex-President Grover Cleveland on a fishing trip in Florida in April of 1889. The Patchogue Advance reported that the Meeks property was the finest in Bayport and that the colonel took great pride in keeping his beautiful grounds and lawns scrupulously neat and trim. He created a park at the rear of the property, which included a grove, walks, settees, and artificial ponds. Part of Long Island's colonial heritage can still be seen here on South Ocean Avenue. Lop trees are trees whose trunks were purposely bent as saplings by landowners and farmers. The trunks of lop trees grew upwards from the ground for 2 or 3 feet. Then the trunk was bent and tied down, so the tree grew horizontally for a stretch, and then vertically again. These lop trees were used as living fences in colonial days and afterwards. They surrounded cultivated fields and pasture land and acted as property lines along Ocean Avenue. These trunks continue to attract attention because of their peculiar shape. They are truly a part of Bayport's living history. Dr. Walter McCullough had this house built for his family in the 1920s. Unfortunately, his wife Anne died of influenza here at the age of 23. It's hard to believe that this beautiful home was once a safe house in the late 20s and early 30s. A safe house is a place where criminals would come and have surgery and be able to recuperate safely away from the law. One-time local resident Catherine Manton, daughter of Judge Martin Manton, who we'll meet later, recalled in 1987 that the doctor who lived here housed a group of shady characters. She reported mysterious goings-on. For recreation, the outlaws would take pot shots at the chicken houses of the Manton estate. Henry Asmus and his wife built this house in 1882 on land they purchased from Edward Edwards. Henry owned a real estate and insurance company in Sayville, moving his business to Brooklyn a few years later. He sold the house to New York City Police Captain John McElwain and his wife Melinda in 1885. Sadly, Melinda passed away here just 2 years later of Bright's disease. Captain McElwain must have been distraught as he had the house packed up and he moved back to the city, selling the house to Bernard and Anna Peelsticker. By 1902, the estate had changed hands again, this time being sold to the family of Richard Fitzpatrick. Before they moved in, the family hired architect Isaac Green to remodel their house and had the work done by contractor Fred Smith, whose house we'll see later. Just a year after these improvements, the Fitzpatricks had a gas machine and fixtures for lighting installed. This suggests the house only had kerosene lamps up until this time. It would be another 10 years before electricity came to Bayport. The pictures you see here are of the Fitzpatrick family outside their home. If you were looking down Ocean Avenue 100 years ago, you would have seen a beautiful tree-lined road covered in crushed oyster shells. The oyster shells were readily available thanks to the local booming oyster business along the Great South Bay. The oyster shells helped keep roads compacted, making travel easier for horses and wagons. On a hot, dry day, the dust from the crushed oyster shells would permeate the air like chalk. Twice a day, a wagon would travel through the streets of Bayport, spraying water in an effort to keep this dust down. Susan S. Fackler bought the property here from Edward Edwards in 1884. The house was built shortly after that. Like many summer residents on Ocean Avenue, the Facklers rented their estate when they traveled elsewhere for the season. The Facklers sold their property to John H. Black in 1897. The following year, the Blacks had their cottage painted, 3 coats outdoors, and painted and papered on the interior. They also hired Jedlicka Brothers of Sayville for fitting the cottage with all modern improvements, which probably included gas lighting and plumbing. One Sunday evening in January of 1900, Ernest Smith was strolling down Ocean Avenue, passing the Black estate here. He was suddenly attacked by a bulldog belonging to Mrs. Black. Fortunately, the only wound to Ernest was his badly torn trousers and maybe his ego. Mrs. Black passed away here in 1903 while her husband was away on business. Interestingly, Mr. Black married neighbor Maud Bruckheimer less than a year after his wife's death. Talk about small-town gossip. The Borum family purchased the estate in 1904. The photos here show the family enjoying their property. Captain Joseph M. Vaughn bought this property in 1875, and the house seen here was probably built shortly after. In 1883, he sold his estate to Reverend Henry Platt of New York City. Captain Vaughn had made many friends in Bayport, but died unexpectedly in Florida in the next year, cut off in the prime of his life. After purchasing the house, the Patchogue Advance reported that Mr. Pratt takes great pride in his country seat and stands admiring it as a fond mother her firstborn. Father Pratt's sister, Mrs. Franklin, lived with him and spent summers here as well. The estate was made up of 4 1/3 acres and a carriage house. It was noteworthy for the original gates and picket fence that curved at the entrances. Although still present in 1980, the fence is long gone now. Notice the 2 magnificent weeping beeches, the king of trees for the estates of the wealthy. The house to our right was built by Joseph Wagner in about 1880. In 1885, it was sold to Reverend Pratt, who already owned the house we just visited. The Reverend used this house as a guest cottage that he would rent for the summer season. This sad sight of a once glorious mansion was the summer estate of John Morgan, his wife Sarah, and their 4 sons and 2 daughters. They called the estate Idlehour, like the Vanderbilt estate in Oakdale that became Dowling College. The house was built in 1879 by Arnold and Weeks for Garrett and Charlotte Martens and was owned by the Morgans by 1886. It was later enlarged by Isaac Green as the Morgan family had more children. John Morgan was born in Ireland in 1837 and moved to the U.S. when he was 7. He began a business bottling mineral water and later expanded into soft drinks, especially ginger ale. His company became very successful and was the largest mineral water establishment in New York City by 1903. Sarah Morgan sponsored a dancing class for the young people of Bayport, including her 2 daughters, Sadie and Gertrude. At the end of the summer, she would hold a tea dance here at Idlehour, and all would be invited. The family took full advantage of the bay, enjoying sailing, fishing, and ice skating, and ice scootering in the winter. In 1911, John and Sarah celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a party here on Ocean Avenue. Mr. Morgan died of pneumonia 4 years later in New York City. Mrs. Morgan passed away in 1934 at the age of 91. A mass was said for her at St. Lawrence Church in Sayville, as the Morgans were devout Catholics who attended mass there. They didn't attend Our Lady of the Snow because it wasn't built until 1917. Morgan Beverages merged with White Rock Soda in 1952. The company is run today by the great-great-grandson of John and Sarah Morgan. George and Amy Bishop had this house built in 1879. George had businesses that dealt in oysters and gingerine. In 1880, they added an extension to the home to take in boarders for the summer season. William Erkenbrack was the next owner of the estate, and he called it May Cottage. He died soon after purchasing the property and left behind a wife and daughter who kept the house until 1908. That summer, Frederick and Isabel Wengenroth moved in with their 2-year-old son. The little boy would go on to become one of the most important lithographers of the 20th century. Stowe Wengenroth studied art in Europe, Woodstock, New York, and Eastport, Maine. His first exhibit was in 1931. Although the subjects for most of his prints are scenes in Maine and Massachusetts, Stowe made several prints based in Bayport. There are 3 he made of the barn that used to be on the property: Winter Lace, Early Summer Bayport, and Summer Morning Bayport. The Wengenroths owned the house until 1940. After that, Stowe and his wife divided their time between Massachusetts and Greenport. The Wengenroth home in Greenport still stands on Main Street. Young architect and builder Henry Wicks finished the house that once stood here for Barney McGuire and his family in 1885 for $8,000. 4 years later, Barney would be present when John L. Sullivan defeated Jake Kilrain in the last bare-knuckle boxing match in Richburg, Mississippi. Barney won $10,000 betting on Sullivan. The estate was purchased in 1910 by Cleveland and Sophia Pratt, with builder Fred Smith making some alterations. In 1924, Cleveland fell through the ice in the Great South Bay. His son, Cleveland Jr., skated to his father at top speed and, lying flat on the edge of the quaking ice, pulled him out by hand and foot, saving his life. Jr. would later graduate from the U.S. Naval Academy. Mrs. Pratt was active in raising money for the Salvation Army and the Red Cross, and Mr. Pratt was the secretary for the New York Society for the Prevention of Vice, which was responsible for banning such books as D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. He was also president of our school board for 2 years. In 1927, Mrs. Pratt was bit by an insect while working in the garden here. The bite became infected and she passed away 10 days later. 5 years later, Mr. Pratt would join her, having had a heart attack at his son's home in Brooklyn. Unfortunately, the house burned down in the 1990s and was replaced by the contemporary Victorian we see here. In 1886, Charles F. Stoppani purchased all the land on the east side of Ocean Avenue from John R. Ellie. After becoming engaged to Ida Maloney in 1897, Charles's son Joseph decided to establish his own estate on the Stoppani family property. Joseph hired local architect Isaac Green to design the elegant neoclassical structure we see here. The Stoppanis called their new home Liberty Hall. The home originally had clapboard siding, and unfortunately, the original colonnaded portico was removed some years ago. Joseph ran a brokerage firm for the Consolidated Stock Exchange. He was charged with grand larceny in 1914 when a client who invested $5,000 received neither his stock nor his money back. Stoppani served 18 months in Sing Sing, and his reputation was ruined. Ultimately, Liberty Hall was sold to Judge Martin Manton in 1916 for $30,000. He renamed it Fair Acres and had the exterior of the house stuccoed. A local Sayville lawyer, Manton became the youngest federal judge in the country when he was appointed to the Southern District Court of New York by Woodrow Wilson in 1916. The judge built up his fortune over the years and was considered a millionaire by 1929. But I guess we know what happened in 1929. The public didn't know that Manton was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. On January 30th, 1939, Martin T. Manton resigned in an effort to stop the House of Representatives from impeaching him. The judge was indicted on 3 counts of conspiracy in the sale of justice, or as we would say, bribery. He served 17 months in federal prison, and, like Joseph Stoppani, his reputation was destroyed. The Queen Anne cottage you see here is the oldest surviving building on Ocean Avenue. It was built sometime prior to 1850. In 1853, Jonah and Mary Smith sold the 1-acre property, house, and outbuildings to Clark Smith for $1,000. Notice how the main roof extends down to create the front porch on the right side. By 1915, the house was being used as the superintendent's cottage for the Stoppani mansion to the south, also known as Arcadia. The shingle-style Georgian house we see here looks much different from the house Harriet Paff built in 1887 for $4,000. Mrs. Paff was a resident of Bayport for over 25 years at that time. She died the following year of Bright's disease at the old age of 89, the oldest person in Bayport. Charles A. Post bought the estate at auction from Henry Asmus, and in 1892 hired Sayville contractor Robert Nuns to dramatically alter and enlarge the house. Sometime soon after, Post's stepson, Waldron Post, and his family were the owners, and spent summers here with their winter quarters in Lawrence. Mr. Post added a carriage house in 1896, and Mrs. Post's childhood playhouse was trucked here from Glen Cove one May Saturday in 1889. In 1902, Waldron had Fred Smith remodel 2 rooms into a handsome dining room paneled in mahogany. The west side of the foot of Ocean Avenue was the location of the mansion that attorney William Foster had built here in 1887 for $35,000. Foster didn't spend much time here, however. Caught embezzling money, he fled the country to escape prosecution. The property was purchased by Charles and Marie Caroline Post and their blended family in 1890. Marie Caroline was the daughter of French immigrant and Civil War Brigadier General Philippe Régis de Trobriand. The general died here in 1897 and is buried at St. Anne's. In 1891, Post had William Arnold make extensive renovations to the estate. The estate was 24 acres and included servants' quarters, chauffeurs, gardeners' quarters, 2 boathouses, a greenhouse, a beach house, and large formal gardens. An amateur astronomer, Post even added a complete observatory, which was later donated to Harvard University. Charles A. Post helped form the Bayport Fire Department and became its first chief. His stepson Waldron, who we just met at our last house, would soon follow in his footsteps. Waldron's brother Regis was the governor of Puerto Rico from 1907 to 1909. The family was known to entertain such notables as the Vanderbilts, Sudams, Reverend Prescott and family of St. Anne's Church, and the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. The family sold the estate in 1953. Plans to subdivide the property resulted in the demolition of the main house shortly thereafter. In 1826, William Randall sold the property here on the east side of the foot of Ocean Avenue to Jonah Smith. The 125-acre property extended from the bay all the way up to Montauk Highway. After Jonah's death, his son William purchased the property from his father's estate. William was a farmer and boat builder who had lived in New Jersey. He brought his skills to Bayport, and many boats were launched from his boatyard here on the Great South Bay between 1862 and 1879. His grandson, Hervey Garrett Smith, was instrumental in the creation of the Suffolk County Maritime Museum. In 1879, the south half of the farm and boatyard was sold to Henry C. Ellie, who sold it to his brother John the following year. In 1886, the 50-acre estate was purchased by Charles F. Stoppani, whose son we met earlier at Liberty Hall. Charles named his estate Arcadia and hired Isaac Green to construct a new house to the west of the existing farmhouse in 1888. The property was eventually sold to Charles's daughter, E. Jenny, and her husband, Stephen Cox. Although the building was still standing in 1946, it is totally gone today.
As we make our way onto Fairview Avenue, our first stop is this large and interesting house. It was built by the Stoppanis as a barn or poultry house and was originally located somewhere west of here, facing the bay. Probably built in the 1890s, Carolyn Manton, daughter of Judge Manton of Fair Acres, wrote that her father moved the structure here in the 1920s and made a hobby of raising chickens to sell to local hotels. Perhaps this is the chicken house that was shot at by the shady characters we met earlier at the McCullough House. The poultry house was converted to a residence in the late 1940s. The house that originally stood here was known as the Cupola Place and was purchased by the notorious Theodore Allen and his wife in 1883. Theodore, known as Thee Allen, had extensive renovations made by Isaac Green at that time. New York papers called Thee Allen the wickedest man in New York. Early in his career, he ran a bar room noted for its criminal activity. He later opened his West Side Social Club, a saloon and dance hall at Bleecker and South Fifth Avenue. The club was a center for illegal gambling and was raided over 100 times. Despite this, and being involved in several murders, Thee served very little prison time. In 1891, he was brutally attacked with an ice pick at his club, but survived, although part of his nose was bitten off. Thee died in 1908 of pneumonia, although his brother and sister insisted he had been poisoned. His estate passed to his granddaughter, Mrs. Minnie Owens, and her husband. On the night of April 28, 1911, Minnie smelled smoke shortly after 5 a.m. and woke her husband in the next room. They escaped and ran to a neighbor's to call the fire department. Minnie saved 3 of her dogs, but 4 were lost in the blaze. The total loss was estimated to be between $30,000 and $40,000, quite a deal of money in those days. The original 3-story carriage house to the rear survived and was converted into a private residence sometime later. Well, this scene should look familiar. This summer house was built for Captain Christian Huss, his wife Henrietta, and their 6 children in 1887. It was originally located to the south of here. Captain Huss was a boat pilot at Sandy Hook, New Jersey. In April of 1908, the family had the house enlarged by Fred Smith, who lived just up the road. The original clapboard siding was also stuccoed at this time. Later that year, the captain died at this house of stomach cancer at the age of 53. A delegation from the Elks Club came for a memorial service, as did Reverend Herman Zoller of St. John's Lutheran Church in Sayville. His son Carl followed in his father's footsteps and also became a Sandy Hook boat pilot. In the 1920s, John H. Delaney, a friend of Judge Manton from across the street, purchased this house on its original property and the property to the north. He then had this house moved to the foundation of Thee Allen's house, which had burned down about 15 years prior. And here it sits today. The colonial revival structure that once stood here was the carriage house for Joseph Stoppani's Liberty Hall estate. It was designed by architect Isaac Green and built in 1897. After Judge Manton bought the estate, the carriage house was used as a 4-car garage. About 40 years ago, the building was converted to a private residence, an example of repurposing old Bayport that preserves our history. Unfortunately, the house was demolished a few years ago. The Suffolk County News reported the construction of this charming cottage in May of 1902. It served as the gardener's cottage for Joseph Stoppani's Liberty Hall estate. The stucco finish is probably the original siding. The contractor for the house was Sayville resident Boss Nelson Strong. Strong was also the contractor for John Ellis Roosevelt's summer estate, Meadowcroft, which is a museum run by the Bayport-Blue Heritage Association. We hope you'll come down for a tour this summer. 2 weeks after reporting the building of the gardener's cottage, which you can barely see through the trees here, the paper announced the construction of a small barn nearby. The structure we see here, just south of the cottage, is probably the barn mentioned in the article, which would make it 120 years old.
Barns typically suffer from deterioration due to weather, moisture, and their own inherent vice. So this building is in fairly good condition. Barns typically don't have foundations, although this building has an interesting concrete platform on the outside. The structure here has places for horses, a tack room, and as we look up, a hayloft. Loose hay could have been thrown up to the door here from the top of a wagon. More likely, bales of hay were hoisted up by a block and tackle attached to the post. As we make our way around the barn, notice the Dutch-type doors with a taller bottom section that would allow horses to look out from the top while keeping them in the barn. The homeowner has added a lovely deck here to allow guests to literally sit in the shadow of history. It seems fitting to end our tour here at the home of Fred D. Smith. Fred was a prominent local builder who worked on many of the houses we just visited. He also did work for the South Side Sportsman's Club, which is now Connecticut State Park. In 1930, he repaired and improved a dam, and in 1936, he worked on a fish tank for a truck. This may have been to transport trout from the hatchery to the main pond for fishing. Frank built this house sometime before 1911, as it was here that the Allen's granddaughter, Minnie, ran to notify the Bayport Fire Department of the fire that the house her grandfather built 3 decades earlier was being destroyed. Fred Smith and his family lived here for over 30 years. Well, this concludes our tour, and I thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you in person next year for our summer solstice tour.